You know, you don't often get an opportunity to get into somebody's lab, and we have the opportunity this week to spend time in the GM Fuel Cell Lab here in Pontiac, Michigan. We're going to spend some time with Charlie Fries, who's been at this about 15 years after a long career in diesel engines. Charlie knows what there is to know, and he's going to explain a lot of what we'll see today. Hope you enjoy it. I'm here with Charlie Fries, who's the executive director of Hydrotech at General Motors. Hydrotech being the product name, really, for fuel cells, which GM is really starting into, right, John? I mean,
that's right.
This is now the real time. I mean, you and I go way back, and I have to tell the audience that we worked together about 7 years ago, and even before that, I think at one point when I was part of General Motors. And you know, what's interesting to me is walking through your lab, which we'll get a chance to see in a little bit, just how this place really has grown.
Yeah, when you were here, I mean, we've done multiple additions to the lab because we frankly ran out of space. The walls just were too tight. And now we've got product here that we can talk about as well.
That's right. And I'm looking forward to you taking us through some of that, as well as some things that go into that, because, you know, you do have a lot of test cells. You've got a lot of, you know, sort of production shakeout activity here in Pontiac. And then south of here, south of Detroit, Brownstown, which is which is where you're manufacturing in a joint venture with Honda, and they're going to use their output for cars, I believe. You've got some new customers, though. Why don't you take us through just a few of those announcements that you've made recently?
Yeah, so as you said, Brownstown is where we have our joint venture with Honda, where we do the manufacturing. So that's in a facility. We make the fuel cell systems. And those systems are, as you mentioned, used by Honda, but they're also used by GM in a number of applications. When we make the fuel cell system in Brownstown, it moves into another site where we do the power cube manufacturing. So that's basically taking a fuel cell system and integrating a lot of the other bits around it that make it actually drop in to different applications without having to do a lot of customization of the application to run a fuel cell. So you can think about air filtration, power electronics for boosting the voltage of the system, things like that. And that gives us a product that you can integrate into a wide range of applications. And we've announced recently Autocar as one of the users of the system. So we're doing some development work in Class 8 trucks now with those systems. And you can imagine large, for instance, maybe a cement truck or a refuse hauler, those kinds of things, all powered by Hydrotech fuel cell systems. And that's one of the things that we're developing.
I can remember you used to have a chart, you may still use it, and it showed sort of best use cases for fuel cells. And I believe there was a bus at the top of it. But the idea being that they've always been about power needing heavier vehicles, basically. That's kind of the best use, isn't it?
Yeah, so GM's in an interesting spot because we're a battery company. We're also a fuel cell company. And so when we do electrification, we want to be able to electrify the breadth of the different products, even outside of our own portfolio. And to do that and do it well, you need to have both the battery technology and the fuel cell technology. They're very good complements to each other. So the way to think of a battery is a battery plays in these areas where you don't need the very high range, a lot of energy storage density. You can package enough battery on board to hit the hundreds of miles that a typical driver would require for your everyday vehicle. But when you start to get into vehicles that haul really heavy payloads, and I'm not talking about half-empty boxes for package delivery, I'm talking about really heavy boxes or really steel or liquids, fluids, things that have a lot of mass to them. And if you're hauling very long distances, and if it's a commercial vehicle that you want to keep the wheels moving so you earn money with it, that's where you need to have the ability to put a lot of energy on board the vehicle and refuel quickly. So hydrogen is the solution for both of those.
Well, another of your customers or partners or whatever you want to call it is Komatsu, and they make really big vehicles. And presumably these type of things sitting behind us, these power cubes, are exactly the point, is to put something like that in there. And then, of course, try to have hydrogen nearby. And we can talk about the infrastructure in a few minutes. But the idea being that these are, as you said, drop-in, parcels, really, that you can, power all kinds of things. Komatsu can find, and then you have the Department of Energy project on the medium-duty trucks. Interesting that it's medium-duty to me because, you think of a Class 5 and 6 vehicle and you say, well, does that really need a fuel cell? Or would it be better served with, battery electric? I mean, that kind of thing.
Yeah, so this is the building block. This is the way to think about it. So if we put these together, even though this system might be producing not at a megawatt scale, right? I mean, it's a relatively small box, but if you want to get to megawatt scale, maybe 2 megawatts like you would have on one of the Komatsu 930Es, then you can scale it up as an array. So you can put multiple fuel cell systems, power cubes in this case, into an array on the vehicle, and then you can hit megawatt scale, all with a common building block. And that's part of what goes behind how we design these systems, is to make sure that they are scalable that way. When you start talking about the application that you were mentioning, like that DOE fleet that we're doing the work, that's really to explore that space, understand it with different fleet users, and understand what's special about their applications. Because what we're finding is that even though they're not hauling, 50,000 pounds across the country, they are demanding a lot of energy. And it's about energy, because hydrogen is a way to store a lot of electrons in a form that you can maintain them for a long period of time and onboard a vehicle. So by putting that capability into those vehicles, those are trucks that might run for extended periods of time in a stationary format, running equipment that's off the vehicle. So it's portable power takeoff.
Yeah, yep.
Right? That's a very important thing. It might be running a boom. So you might have to have a boom that you're operating. So even though the vehicle itself might have a range that could be potentially managed with the battery,
right,
all the extended use would be very challenging to satisfy with the battery. So that's where hydrogen comes in and unlocks that value. And if you think about it, a utility company, those vehicles might all tend to operate in a very narrow radius from wherever their hub is. But when there's something like a hurricane in Florida, you'll see all of those trucks pack up and go down to Florida. So they have to have long range also.
Right.
So they don't buy a vehicle for short range and a vehicle for long range. They buy a vehicle and it needs to do everything.
What about sort of bidirectional charging? Again, think of a natural disaster where you might have no power in an area. Does that hydrogen power that you use in EPTO, is that something where you could actually charge other things with it besides just equipment?
Absolutely. And so you may have seen some of the things that we've done exploring what a hydrogen fuel cell looks like in terms of a generator, a power generator. And we've been running those. There's some really good online videos where you can see where we've done things like put those systems out into the middle of a desert, some sort of a difficult to reach environment where there's not ready-made infrastructure and you can't get there very fast, right? It's not like you're going to just go in and roll in with something else to charge a vehicle, and it probably wouldn't be capable anyway. And you can't wait to put in permanent infrastructure. So in those situations, you can fill that need with something that's basically clean, zero emissions, and it's a high energy producer.
Let's talk about infrastructure for just a minute, both the infrastructure for hydrogen and then the idea of using fuel cells for stationary power, because we've got a lot of infrastructure going into power electric trucks. We've got mandates in California. You have carrots and sticks involved out there in terms of moving to an electric truck basis. Hydrogen is part of that in terms of trucks, but the idea being that the charging sites, and many people are getting into that space, does a Hydrotech block make sense as stationary power, either for backup or for primary power for something like that?
Yeah, so it really depends. And I think what's interesting about hydrogen is, and we've talked about this before, right? I mean, hydrogen is something it's an energy carrier, and it doesn't matter where the energy came from at its original source. It could be a renewable energy source like wind or solar. It could be something that came from steam methane reforming natural gas. It doesn't matter to the hydrogen and the fuel cell that uses it. It can use it from a wide range of applications. But the other thing is you can move in and out of the grid or other devices using that energy. So it's a long-term storage tool. And that's different than a battery. You see, if you're thinking about backing up, let's say, a server farm, and you want to use renewable energy, you're going to always deal with the irregularity of the sun, or sometimes the wind is blowing, sometimes it's not.
Yep,
and what are you going to do in those situations? If you're going to base the whole system on that energy source, you have to have a buffer. And the buffer needs to extend in more than a day or two. It needs to potentially extend for a week or two or more, right? So if I have the wind not blowing for 3 weeks, or I've got my other sources of energy, like the electrical grid, become unavailable because of a storm, then you need some other way to buffer that. And hydrogen can serve that buffering role. So one of the things we've announced recently is that the work that we're doing, taking the technology from Hydrotech coupling that up with electrolyzers. So this is a work that we're doing with our partners, Nel. Nel Hydrogen.
Right.
So
Yep.
Nel makes electrolyzers, and you can think of an electrolyzer, I mean, in a very simple way, it's a fuel cell running in reverse.
Reverse, yeah.
So what we can think of is now using Hydrotech technology that we've already been through the path of learning about scale, learning about taking the cost out, learning about improving the efficiency dramatically. And if we take that technology, meld that with what Nel brings of knowing how to make electrolyzers and knowing how to integrate them and how to operate them and all the things that go behind that, we can make much more affordable electrolyzers that can make the hydrogen that comes out the end of it much more affordable as well.
It's a growing area. I mean, Cummins is into it. Just about every Siemens, just about everybody is at least dabbling in. Even Plug Power, are doing electrolyzers at this point. It feels like an area, and Cummins is building a huge business around it. They're looking at $400 million in revenue by next year, I believe, from electrolyzers. And it's interesting that, in fact, it's a former colleague of ours who's running that business for them now. But it is interesting to note that there's some issues with electrolyzers in terms of energy use to make it, the electricity needed as well as the water in some cases, to do it. But you do see an opportunity then for building out infrastructure perhaps with this type of technology.
In some places, it'll make sense, right? As a stationary backup. So you mentioned server farms. Server farms could be a very interesting application because they're typically in areas that might be difficult to permit other types of backup power generation systems. They can't go down. They have to be running all the time. So you need the reliability, the durability. You can get that from a fuel cell. You want to have this connectivity with something that allows you to take that green energy and then access it and store it on site. So hydrogen can be that storage device. So for that, those outage periods, that's where you can think about using a fuel cell. It makes a lot of sense.
And it's interesting when you talk about either data centers or server farms or that type of application. I have to get into this. That 15 years ago, you were into diesel, and most GenSets are diesel GenSets today, right? I mean, now
it's kind of ironic, isn't it?
Is it kind of? Yeah. I mean, you sort of caught on early to this, didn't you? We should talk a little bit about your background because I think you come out of the original Detroit diesel operation, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah.
So what has it been like? Just briefly, what's it been like to move from that traditional, power, which is still very with us, right?
Yeah,
it's not going away.
I love diesels. Diesels are great.
Okay.
We've got some great diesels like the Duramax diesels in our products, and they do an excellent job. And for many applications, they are the right answer. But at some point, right, when you're forced to go into an all-electric solution in some of those places that maybe today you can get away with, using something like a diesel, someday you're going to need something that can replace a diesel. And sometimes that day is now. Sometimes it might be, more out in the future, depending upon the application. And what we can start to think about here is the way to replace a diesel is with a fuel cell. Mm-hmm. And just like we've always had gasoline and diesel propulsion systems before, you can think you're going to have battery and you're going to have fuel cell propulsion systems in the future. And it just comes right back to that same thing. A diesel's very well suited for the heaviest of applications. Very durable requirements. Efficiency is what's demanded of those applications. And they're often some kind of a vehicle that's earning money for the operator. So you need to make sure all those requirements are met. That very much overlaps with what the fuel cell does. It provides that durable, reliable, long-term operation, heavy payloads, heavy long distances, and lets you fuel quickly. And those are the things that we can do when we have a fuel cell going into those applications. But there's another kind of interesting thing. Everybody likes to talk about the infrastructure, and it's true. We have an immature infrastructure for hydrogen today, and that needs to be addressed. But it's interesting if you think about the way the diesel came into many markets. It didn't just naturally drop in. It wasn't necessarily the obvious choice. When you start talking about pickup trucks, there was a day where there weren't diesel-powered pickup trucks. And a lot of the skeptics said it'll never happen because there isn't going to be a diesel infrastructure in all the places that a pickup driver will insist upon refueling their vehicle. And they're not going to want to go to a truck stop. What happened? The engines found their way into the trucks. People started experiencing them. It added to their capability, did an excellent job for what the customer expected. The capability of the truck was improved. And they were willing to take the added nuisance of going to a truck stop, right?
Right.
Over time, as more and more got onto the road, that infrastructure expanded. And so pretty soon it wasn't at a truck stop. Now it's at every Meijer gas station. It's every corner has a diesel pump now. And it was because it began from those more predictable fleet type operations, commercial applications, heavy energy consumers. And then as the infrastructure built out and more vehicles got on the road, then it started to proliferate. And that's where you get the distributed network of diesel stations that you see today. Hydrogen can be the same kind of a solution.
If you're okay, let's take a little walk. I want to see you describe some of what you've got here. I mean, we came to Pontiac, the Detroit area, because it's so much better to get a chance to have you show us what's going on than just talk about it. So maybe you can show us something.
Yeah, sure, no problem. Great. So this is the Generation Zero fuel cell system that we had in the Equinox. We also used a system like this in a number of other applications, whether it was some of the very early work we did with the Navy in submarines. We used these in the ZH2 Colorado. So there's been a number of different places we applied some of that technology. And to the left are the things that predate that. Some of these go back decades, but we also, if you were to go even further to the left, which we're obviously not, there would be something like a Electrovan, which in the 60s was the very first hydrogen fuel cell vehicle. And GM did that. We drove it around actually the tech center. And that was what started it all. But it had a lot of work to do. And you can just tell from the status of the technology in these prior years, it was too big. It took an Electrovan to haul the technology around for both hydrogen storage and the fuel cell itself. And it wasn't until we came to this Gen Zero that it started to become practical to integrate into kind of a modern vehicle. And then we came up to this point here, and this is where we started to work really focused on maintaining a small package, but also making sure that the system was more affordable. It still wasn't ready to go to production because it was still too expensive, but this is a much more simplified design than what's in here. This had 2 stacks of 220 cells each. This system here, we got it down to about 300 cells, and it was one single stack. So the mechanization of the overall design was pretty dramatically simplified. A lot of other things to bring costs down, like going to metallic bipolar plates as opposed to the graphite composite plates that were in this system, and a lot of other system integration that took costs out. And then the soft goods, the things that make the fuel cell work, like the membrane and the electrodes, dramatic improvements on that. So this system here had about 93 grams of platinum inside the system to make it work. And this system took down to less than half of that.
Charlie, you do a ton of testing on these things. What are we walking by here? What's going on?
Yeah, so what these are examples of these are short stack tests. So on the other side of this area is where we do coupon tests. We work on all the materials, we get them right. We have a lot of those test cells, and so we screen it. We find the ones that work, the ones that don't work, and we weed it down to the ones that really work. This is where we bring it up to a short stack. So it's still not a complete stack. It doesn't cost as much to make it. We can interrogate that stack in the test and see what really proves out when we start integrating a whole stack of cells. So most of these are running about 28 cells, and we can evaluate it as a fuel cell system would see it. And the other thing we could do is we can take multiple chemistries and test them in the same stack with what we call a rainbow stack. And so we can evaluate them. They're all seeing exactly the same conditions, and we can find out if in relation to each other, which ones perform and which ones aren't.
An elimination test of sorts.
Yeah, and with a lot of data collection to go with it.
Yeah, so you have the data to use if something comes around again, and there's opportunity to apply that.
Exactly. And another interesting thing is we built in a lot of modeling to take the things that we normally would have been forced to do in the laboratory, and now we can do it in math. So this is the other place that we validate those math models with some detailed physical tests.
You mentioned earlier, and I thought it was fascinating, that during COVID, a lot of people were able to keep this place running from their home computers, essentially.
That's right. Yeah, we still ran the facility, and we didn't have everybody, packed in here. So by operating at home through their own computers, they were able to get in and monitor and change their tests.
And I know we won't get into the specifics, but you've got hundreds of people involved in fuel cells here.
We got a big team.
Yeah.
But very capable.
Yeah. This last one down here, same thing, the rainbow approach?
Same kind of thing. Yep.
Mm-hmm. So Charlie, here's the thing. You've got next to you a full power cube, Hydrotech power cube. Mm-hmm. Obviously, a lot's going on behind the pretty blue panel here. Why don't you show us a little bit about what that is?
Sure. So this is the finished production unit. You can You can see it here. This is what it looks like. But you can't tell all the detail that's inside. So the reason we do this is to make it easier to integrate. And we can almost drop this into a lot of applications where a lot of the things that would normally have to be separately integrated into the vehicle or under hood are now all inside the box. So the core is the fuel cell system. That's kind of buried down here in the bottom. It's a little hard to see it because of the other things that are around here. But on top, we have boost converters. So this is where we bring the output of the fuel cell up to a bus voltage that the vehicle demands. So that's up to it'll boost that up. And then we have also the things that manage like filtration of the air coming in, the exhaust coming out, dealing with how we exhaust it out of the system. We also have sensors, safety systems, all the things that basically move fluids in and out of the box and support the fuel cell. Those would normally be under hood in a typical vehicle application. But the other thing that's interesting is if you come around to the back side here. So when we look at the back of it, it looks a lot different than the front. And the reason for that is this is the surface where all the vehicle interfaces come in. So whether it's in a vehicle or a stationary application or other mobile applications that we're working on, we can handle this in a very standardized way. So we bring in air from the outside, we bring in coolant from whatever the vehicle is, whatever we're using for a radiator system. We exhaust the coolant back out of the system that way. We have connections for controls, for hydrogen input, and exhaust of the whole overall system where our exhaust product is water. So that's basically the whole power cube in kind of an integrated design. So this is an example of one of our environmental chambers where we can evaluate a fuel cell at very cold operation and can evaluate freeze starts, and then at very hot. So we can take us down to -40 or positive 40 degrees C and evaluate how the systems operate.
Obviously, there are similar things done for batteries, but the importance of this to the fuel cell is what?
Well, a fuel cell is something that one of its advantages is the range of operating conditions it can encounter. And the other piece of it is when you freeze a fuel cell, it has water. We have to deal with the water because water, when it freezes, expands. It could crack things. So we have to make sure that the system is capable of managing that. Yeah, you saw the fuel cell power cubes that we were building into test properties, right? And some of those were production units. Some of them were prototypes. This particular system now has been integrated into the test cell. So all of that standardized set of connections that are on one side of the unit now have been connected to the test cell to simulate what would either happen in the vehicle or maybe in a stationary power unit. And we can then run the system through its paces. And what this is doing is we can operate it and simulate very long life because we're always searching for the limits. We want to find out if you have limited parts and extreme conditions. And we'll find ways to actually accelerate the tests because if you're running tens of thousands of hours, it could get very difficult to get that within a reasonable amount of time. So we can make the conditions even worse for the propulsion system or the power cube and then simulate that in a shorter amount of time and try to find the limits of the system.
So sort of artificial aging of sorts.
That's a way to think about it.
Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, if you're running a marathon every day, you're going to wear yourself out, right? You might run it once in a while, or you might run a 5K and it might be a lot easier on you. Here we're running extended marathons all the time.
So now you know what the GM fuel cell lab looks like, at least some of it. You're not going to get to know everything because there is proprietary stuff in here. However, we really appreciate GM letting us in today. Thanks for watching.